It was a bright, clear afternoon in the village of St Mary Mead, and the air carried the scent of early summer flowers, mingled with the faint aroma of freshly baked scones. The usually quiet village was abuzz with activity, for the annual garden party at Lavender Cottage was the highlight of the season. Miss Marple, in her neatly pressed blue cardigan and soft grey skirt, sat quietly in her favourite wicker chair near the rose border, watching the comings and goings with mild amusement. Mrs. Lavinia Pettigrew, the host, flitted about like a sparrow with a tray of tiny sandwiches, her pearls jangling with every hurried gesture. "Do take another scone, Miss Marple, and do try the raspberry jam. It's just made straight from my mother's recipe," she said, smiling broadly. Her eyes, however, darted nervously toward the far end of the lawn, where a group of newcomers were chatting in hushed tones. Miss Marple gave a small polite nod and accepted a scone. She noticed, as she always did, the subtle tensions beneath the polite smiles. There was Mr. Edward Clark, the wealthy landowner whose jovial laughter never reached his eyes. Beside him stood his niece, Miss Charlotte Clark, prim and proper, though her fingers betrayed a slight tremor as she held her teacup. In the shade of the old oak, Mr. Henry Dobson, the village doctor, engaged in what seemed a casual discussion with Reverend Ames. Yet Miss Marple observed the tightness in their postures, old friends perhaps, but carrying unspoken grievances. Children ran about with ribbons and laughter, while the local band played light waltzes that floated lazily over the garden. For a moment it was a scene of perfect English idyll. Yet as Miss Marple sipped her tea, she noticed something slightly amiss. A small odd stain on the edge of the jam jar placed beside the scones. The jar itself was unremarkable, a simple glass vessel, yet the smear seemed out of place, almost as if it had been touched in haste. She made a mental note, though she said nothing. Miss Marple knew that observations were far more valuable than comments at this stage. As the afternoon sun climbed higher, conversation grew more animated. Gossip, as it always did, took centre stage. "Did you hear about the sale of the old mill?" one guest whispered. "I hear there's quite a scandal behind it." Another shook her head, pressing her gloved hands together. "And that's nothing compared to what Mr. Dobson told me about the church accounts. Curious, isn't it? How secrets never stay buried in St. Mary Mead." Miss Marple listened, smiling faintly, and felt the familiar stir of intrigue. Every person had a story, and every story had its shadows. Her sharp eyes roamed the gathering, noting the subtle glances, the slight stiffening of shoulders, the barely audible sighs that spoke of buried discontent. She had long learned that the most ordinary faces often concealed the most extraordinary secrets. The moment that shattered the gentle hum of polite conversation arrived without warning. A piercing shriek came from the direction of the refreshments table. Guests turned in alarm, and Miss Marple rose slowly, her instincts already alert. Mrs. Pettigrew stood rigid, her hand trembling over her mouth, as Edward Clark leaned over his niece, who had suddenly collapsed. The raspberry jam jar had fallen to the ground, rolling slightly across the lawn, and the sweet, innocent preserve it had contained now seemed a harbinger of danger. "Call the doctor!" someone shouted. Miss Marple, however, remained calm, her eyes narrowing slightly. There was no mistaking it. This was no accident. Something about the scene, subtle and almost imperceptible, told her that the idyllic garden party had just become the scene of a serious crime. And so, with polite urgency, she stepped closer, noting the anxious faces and whispered speculations. Little did the villagers know, Miss Marple's quiet, observing mind was already weaving together the threads of a puzzle that would unravel the hidden darkness beneath the sunlit lawns of St. Mary Mead. The garden party, once a scene of cheerful chatter and sunlit leisure, had become a quiet pandemonium. Guests clustered in small knots, exchanging hurried whispers and casting anxious glances toward Miss Charlotte Clark, who lay pale and unresponsive on the soft grass. Edward Clark knelt beside her, his usually confident demeanour faltering as he fumbled for words. Mrs. Pettigrew hovered close, wringing her hands, her pearls clinking like anxious chimes with every movement. "Someone fetch Dr. Dobson at once!" a voice cried, and the village doctor appeared almost immediately, pushing through the throng with purposeful strides. He knelt beside the young woman, checking her pulse and examining her carefully, while Miss Marple observed silently from a few paces back, her keen eyes absorbing every detail. A low murmur spread through the crowd, tinged with fear and speculation. "It must be the jam," someone whispered, while another protested. "Surely it's just a fainting spell, perhaps from the heat." But the hurried glances toward the jar that had toppled and rolled a short distance away suggested that instinctively they sensed something more sinister. Miss Marple, however, paid little attention to the panicked murmurs. She was noting the reactions, the subtle changes in posture, the slightly guilty twitch of a hand here, a forced smile there. Edward Clark's voice trembled. Charlotte, can you hear me? His concern seemed genuine, yet Miss Marple's experience told her that distress could mask far more than it revealed. Meanwhile, Dr. Dobson worked quickly, his brow furrowed. Bring some water, please, and clear the crowd back a little. And the villagers complied, creating a small circle around the girl, while the band had stopped playing and the children had been ushered aside by their mothers. Miss Marple finally stepped closer. She did not need to see the contents of the jam jar to sense that the ordinary had become extraordinary. Something about the way it had fallen, the odd smear she had noticed earlier, and the sudden collapse, all suggested intention rather than accident. Yet she remained composed, as was her custom, letting the villagers' rising panic unfold around her. Whispers circulated quickly, each more speculative than the last. Who would do such a thing? Asked Mrs. Wilkins, a formidable woman with a reputation for sharp opinions. And why? Another guest added, Could it have been an old grudge? The Clark family has had its disagreements, you know. Miss Marple made a mental note of these comments. Each word, each suspicion, whether accurate or wildly mistaken, was a clue to the human heart, the very thing she relied upon to untangle mysteries. As Dr. Dobson stabilised Charlotte and helped her to a nearby chair, Miss Marple's attention drifted to Edward Clark. He seemed deeply distressed, yet there was a certain rigidity in his movements, a tension in his hands that did not entirely belong to worry. Nearby, Mrs. Charlotte's friend, a young woman named Isabel Fenwick, hovered anxiously, offering delicate words of comfort. Miss Marple observed how Isabel's eyes repeatedly flicked toward the fallen jam jar, as though the very object held a secret she feared to speak aloud. The local constable, Constable Harris, arrived promptly, his official presence both reassuring and unsettling. He began questioning the guests, jotting down names and snippets of overheard conversation, while Miss Marple listened silently, her mind quietly sorting facts from conjecture. The villagers, already steeped in the thrill of gossip, offered varying accounts of the moments leading up to the collapse, each tinted by fear, jealousy, or simple misperception. Miss Marple's thoughts, however, focused on details the others overlooked. The slight smear on the jam jar, the absence of any sign of Charlotte having eaten an unusually large quantity of scones, and the peculiar way Edward Clark's hands trembled when he touched the jar. Nothing in the scene was random, she reflected, and each subtlety would matter. In St. Mary Mead, she knew, even the most ordinary of objects, a jam jar, a teacup, a misplaced glove, could carry the weight of a hidden truth. By the time Charlotte was escorted into the shade of the veranda to recover, the villagers had calmed enough to allow conversations to resume, though under a cloud of unease. Speculation swirled, theories multiplied, and while Dr. Dobson gave his professional opinion that there was cause for concern but no immediate danger, Miss Marple's mind quietly began piecing together the puzzle. One thing was certain. What seemed a simple accident at a garden party was likely the first indication of something far more deliberate. And in the quiet corners of her observant mind she resolved to follow each thread, however small, until the truth revealed itself. The evening settled over St. Mary Mead with a quiet that felt almost unnatural, as though the village itself were holding its breath. The garden party had dispersed, leaving only a few lingering guests and a scattering of forgotten napkins and empty teacups. Miss Marple, walking along the rose-bordered path toward the cottage's veranda, noted how the earlier excitement had left an air of strained civility in its wake. Conversations now carried a sharper edge, polite words masking unease, and every glance seemed measured, as if each person feared being observed too closely. Inside the cottage, Mrs. Pettigrew fussed over Charlotte. Still pale but recovering, and Dr. Dobson had reluctantly agreed to stay until he was certain there was no further danger. Miss Marple lingered near the doorway, pretending to inspect a potted fern, but her mind worked with quiet intensity. The smear on the jam jar, the subtle tension in Edward Clark's hands, the anxious glances of Isabel Fenwick, all these observations had lodged themselves firmly in her thoughts. She had learned long ago that human nature, rather than circumstance, often revealed the truth. As the guests trickled out under the fading light, whispers of suspicion followed them. "Did you see how Edward handled the jar?" one remarked to Mrs. Wilkins, who nodded gravely. "And poor Charlotte, so suddenly. Surely something is amiss." Another voice murmured, "It must have been the jam itself. No ordinary mishap could cause such a collapse." Miss Marple's sharp eyes followed these exchanges, noting the interplay of fear, accusation, and relief. Each remark, true or false, carried the faint imprint of the speaker's character. and that, she knew, would be more useful than any hurriedly taken statement. Later, as twilight deepened, Miss Marple found herself alone in the kitchen, examining the now empty jam jar with her practised eye. There was nothing obvious, no broken seal, no tampering visible, but the faint smear she had noticed in the garden had not faded from her memory. It was a detail, yes, but the sort that often mattered more than the most conspicuous evidence. She recalled how the jar had rolled after falling, its trajectory slightly off from what might have been expected if it had simply slipped from the table. There was a subtle irregularity in the scene, an orderliness to the disorder, and Miss Marple understood instinctively that this was no accident. A soft knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. Isabel Fenwick appeared, her expression anxious yet composed, as though she had rehearsed her concern. "Miss Marple, may I speak with you?" she asked in a low voice. The other guests were either gone or occupied, and the village outside had quieted to the occasional call of a bird or the distant sound of a horse-drawn cart. Miss Marple gestured to a chair. "Of course, my dear. Sit down." Isabel hesitated, then lowered herself onto the wooden chair, hands clasped tightly in her lap. "It's dreadful, isn't it?" Isabel said softly, eyes darting toward the veranda where Charlotte still rested. "I cannot imagine who would do such a thing. And yet—" She trailed off, clearly unsure whether to speak further. Miss Marple inclined her head gently, encouraging without pressing. "And yet?" she prompted. Isabel swallowed and continued in a whisper. There was something odd about how Edward acted, even before Charlotte fell. He seemed tense, almost anxious, though I could not understand why. I wanted to mention it to someone, but everyone was so busy fussing over Charlotte. Miss Marple nodded, filing away the comment. Anxiety before a crisis could be as revealing as behaviour after, especially when it contradicted one's usual demeanour. By the time Isabel left, Miss Marple's mind had already begun forming connections. There was a pattern here, subtle but undeniable. A careful placement, a small smear, a measured reaction from certain guests, all pointing toward deliberate design. The village, in its rush to whisper and speculate, missed the quiet truths that only patient observation could reveal. As night fell, Miss Marple settled into her favourite chair by the fire, the soft flicker of flames casting shadows across her thoughtful face. She sipped her tea, listening to the faint rustle of the evening breeze through the lace curtains, and reflected on what she had seen. The garden party had provided the stage, but the play had only just begun. Somewhere among the villagers, motives simmered, secrets lingered, and truths waited, delicate and hidden, for the patient eyes of someone who understood human nature as deeply as she did. She would wait, she would watch, and when the time was right, she would unravel it all. The following morning, St. Mary Mead awoke under a pale, diffuse sunlight, the village streets unusually quiet. Word of Charlotte Clark's sudden collapse had spread swiftly, and though she was now resting safely at Lavender Cottage under Dr. Baird, Dobson's careful supervision, the garden party's earlier cheer had been replaced by a subdued, almost anxious atmosphere. Villagers whispered behind closed doors, exchanging theories that ranged from the trivial to the deeply conspiratorial. Miss Marple, walking along the cobbled lane toward the small post office, observed these murmurs with mild curiosity. She noted the slight hesitations in speech, the furtive glances cast toward one another, and the carefully measured gestures, all signs, she knew, of unsettled nerves and perhaps concealed knowledge. At the post office, she exchanged brief pleasantries with Mrs. Wilkins and a few other early callers, all of whom were eager to hear the latest news. "Dr. Dobson says it was a sudden reaction, though he cannot yet be sure of the cause," Mrs. Wilkins confided, her voice low but filled with urgency. "Some are saying it must have been the jam, but others whisper of poison. Imagine poison in stump." "Mary Mead," Miss Marple smiled faintly, replying with her customary calm, "One never knows what ordinary objects may conceal. It is always best to wait for facts rather than rely on rumour." Returning home, Miss Marple found her small sitting room bathed in morning light. She brewed a cup of tea and settled near the window, her knitting resting unused in her lap as her mind quietly traced the strands of observation she had gathered the previous day. The smear on the jam jar, Edward Clark's unusual tension, Isabel Fenwick's whispered concerns, all formed an intricate web, delicate yet suggestive of design. A knock at the door drew her attention. It was Constable Harris, who had come with the formality of official business but a hint of unease beneath his composed exterior. "Miss Marple," he said, tipping his hat, "I wonder if you might answer a few questions about yesterday. The inspector wishes to have a preliminary account of the guests and their movements." "Of course, Constable," she replied gently, gesturing him inside. though I suspect my observations are of a more social than official nature." She offered him a chair and poured a small cup of tea. Harris accepted, though his eyes lingered on her with a cautious curiosity, aware that her reputation for insight in village matters was well earned. As they spoke, Miss Marple's questions were soft, indirect, yet pointed. She inquired about the order in which guests had arrived, who had handled the refreshments, and which individuals appeared unusually agitated. Harris provided the official account detailing Charlotte's collapse, Edward Clarke's assistance, and the reactions of the remaining guests. Yet it was in the silences, the small hesitations between his words, that Miss Marple gleaned the most. One particular pause when he mentioned Edward Clarke suggested a subtle discomfort, a recognition of incongruities that the constable might have preferred to overlook. After Harris departed, Miss Marple continued her reflections, carefully connecting each detail. The jam jar itself had become a symbol of something more than mere sustenance. It was a potential instrument of intent. She considered the likelihood that an ordinary household object could serve as a deliberate device, and the personalities of those present during the incident. Villagers often believed themselves capable of concealment, yet human behaviour, even in the smallest gestures, rarely lied. By mid-afternoon, a small group of villagers gathered near Lavender Cottage, drawn both by concern and curiosity. Miss Marple, walking toward the cottage under the pretence of a casual visit, noted the careful arrangement of their glances and their guarded conversations. Even as Charlotte sat quietly on the veranda, pale but alert, their murmured exchanges revealed tensions Miss Marple had anticipated, whispered suspicions, subtle accusations, and the natural fear of being implicated. As she approached, Edward Clarke rose to greet her, his movements stiff, his smile slightly forced. "Miss Marple," he said, "I trust Charlotte is recovering well?" His tone was polite, yet Miss Marple sensed a tension she could not attribute solely to concern. Observing him, she noted the subtle twitch of his fingers and the way his eyes occasionally strayed toward the now empty jam jar. Details, she reminded herself, often spoke louder than words. By the time the sun dipped lower in the sky, Miss Marple had already begun quietly mapping the intricate social dynamics of the village. There were layers upon layers of relationships, motives both apparent and hidden, and subtle reactions that hinted at truths waiting to be unearthed. The day's calm was deceptive. Beneath it, currents of suspicion and secrecy swirled, and Miss Marple, as always, was quietly attuned to them, ready to follow each thread until the pattern of intent revealed itself. Evening fell over St. Mary Mead with a soft, amber glow, and the quiet streets gave the village an almost introspective air. Inside Lavender Cottage, Charlotte Clarke rested in a high-backed chair by the window, her cheeks regaining colour, but her hands still trembling slightly. Mrs. Pettigrew hovered nearby, fussing with the arrangement of teacups and napkins, her chatter a constant undercurrent to the tense calm. Miss Marple, seated on a low settee with her knitting basket at her feet, observed everything with the patient attentiveness that had long earned her the trust, and sometimes the trepidation of the village. "Charlotte," she said gently, "how are you feeling now?" The young woman smiled weakly, adjusting the shawl around her shoulders. "Better, thank you, Miss Marple. I do not know what happened yesterday. One moment I was enjoying the party, and the next—" Her voice trailed off, and Miss Marple nodded, her mind cataloguing the subtle clues in Charlotte's demeanour. The slight hesitancy in her speech, the faint, nervous glance toward her uncle, Edward Clarke, and the way she absent-mindedly touched the empty jam jar on the table. Edward stood nearby, hands clasped behind his back, eyes fixed on the floor rather than on his niece. His usual confidence had given way to an almost rigid restraint which did not escape Miss Marple's attention. She sipped her tea, letting the silence stretch comfortably before speaking. "Sometimes the simplest occurrences can conceal a great deal, my dear," she remarked lightly, more to herself than anyone else. Yet Edward's glance flicked up at her, a brief shadow of unease crossing his features, and Miss Marple noted it quietly. The conversation was interrupted by a soft tapping at the door. It was Isabel Fenwick, still looking anxious, though she carried herself with her usual composure. "I hope I am not intruding," she said. "I wanted to be sure Charlotte had everything she needed." Miss Marple gestured her in, and Isabel moved toward the veranda where Charlotte sat. Her eyes, however, kept flicking toward Edward Clarke, and Miss Marple observed the subtle tension in her shoulders, the tight clenching of her hands. Once the room settled into relative calm, Miss Marple began to speak with the careful precision of one gathering information without drawing attention to her intent. "Isabel, did you notice anything unusual yesterday, before Charlotte fell?" she asked softly. Isabel hesitated, her fingers twisting a delicate handkerchief. "Well," she began, It is hard to say. Everything seemed perfectly normal at first, yet there were small things. Mr. Clark seemed distracted, and there was a moment when he handled the jam jar almost too carefully, as though he feared someone might notice. Miss Marple's lips curved into the faintest of smiles, acknowledging the significance of the remark without revealing that she had already observed it herself. The rest of the evening unfolded with a series of polite conversations that carried undercurrents of unease. Dr. Dobson had gone home after ensuring Charlotte was stable, and the cottage settled into a quiet rhythm, punctuated by the occasional cough or shuffle of a guest. Miss Marple, her knitting forgotten, continued to observe. The placement of chairs, the angle of a teacup handle, the glance that lingered too long, all these details seemed to resonate with the subtle irregularities she had noted before. Edward Clark eventually rose to check on Charlotte again, moving towards the kitchen where the jam jar had been stored. Miss Marple watched him carefully. He opened the cupboard slowly, removed the jar and studied it with a deliberate attention that seemed almost theatrical. Then, as if noticing her gaze for the first time, he set it back down and straightened. The gesture was minor, but Miss Marple's experienced eye noted the faint hesitation in his fingers and the careful avoidance of eye contact. Behaviour, she reminded herself, often revealed far more than words. As night deepened and the last of the visitors took their leave, the cottage settled into quietude. Miss Marple, sitting by the fire, reflected on the day's events. The collapse, the anxious reactions, the subtle tensions, these were pieces of a puzzle she would assemble slowly. In her mind, she traced the paths of observation, noting how a single smear, a trembling hand, or a diverted glance could reveal far more than 100 statements of concern. Somewhere beneath the calm, the answers waited, delicate and hidden, and Miss Marple knew that patience, as always, would be her greatest ally. The following morning brought a crisp clarity to St. Mary Mead, and Miss Marple set out on her habitual walk, a quiet basket swinging gently at her side. The village streets were already stirring. Shopkeepers swept their doorsteps, the baker's windows steamed with the morning's fresh bread, and a few early risers paused to exchange subdued greetings. Yet despite the ordinary rhythms, there lingered an undercurrent of tension. The garden party incident had left the villagers uneasy, and every polite nod or cautious smile seemed tinged with suspicion. Miss Marple paused briefly near the post office, observing the small crowd gathered there. Whispers of Charlotte Clark's collapse had already evolved into rumours, each embellished in subtle ways. "Poisoned jam, you say?" Mrs. Wilkins whispered to a friend, lowering her voice as though fearful of being overheard. "Can you imagine?" Another voice murmured, "It's inconceivable in our peaceful village, and yet..." Miss Marple listened patiently, making mental notes of who said what, how they said it, and the tiny expressions that accompanied their words. People often revealed their own motives or fears even while discussing others. Later she made her way to Lavender Cottage, where Charlotte was sitting in the sunlit veranda, a blanket draped over her knees, and Dr. Dobson quietly checking her pulse and temperature. Edward Clark hovered nearby, his composure regained but still slightly constrained, as though he were constantly measuring each gesture. Miss Marple offered gentle greetings, and Dr. Dobson reassured her that Charlotte's recovery was progressing well, though he cautioned that any lingering fatigue should be met with rest. Miss Marple's attention, however, was drawn to the faint traces of anxiety in the room. Isabel Fenwick's hesitant movements, Edward Clark's occasional glances towards the wall, now empty jam jar, and Mrs. Pettigrew's tendency to linger near Charlotte, fussing over minor details. Each of these gestures, trivial as they seemed, formed a pattern she was beginning to recognise. The ordinary behaviour of ordinary people, she reminded herself, often concealed extraordinary truths. As the afternoon wore on, Miss Marple quietly engaged in conversation with a few guests, using casual inquiries to elicit information while remaining unobtrusive. She asked about the sequence of events at the garden party, the movements of various villagers, and any peculiar incidents they might have noticed. Answers were often contradictory, tinged with personal bias or selective memory. But Miss Marple's discerning mind sifted through the inconsistencies. One particular remark from Isabel caught her attention. "I thought I saw Mr. Clark touch the jam jar twice before Charlotte fell, but I cannot be sure. It was only a fleeting movement." Miss Marple noted the hesitancy. Uncertainty in speech could often signal truth buried beneath a veneer of politeness. Edward Clark eventually approached her, ostensibly to inquire after Charlotte's health, yet his tone carried a subtle strain, a careful neutrality that seemed almost rehearsed. Miss Marple greeted him warmly but allowed her gaze to linger on his hands. observing the minor stiffness in his fingers and the faint smudge of soil on one cuff, a detail likely, unnoticed by anyone else. Human behaviour, she knew, often revealed far more than a direct statement could, and she stored each observation quietly. By late afternoon, the small gathering had dispersed, leaving Miss Marple and Charlotte alone on the veranda. Charlotte, though now more composed, reflected aloud on the incident with a mixture of relief and lingering fear. "I do not understand it, Miss Marple," she said softly. "I had only touched the jam briefly, yet it was so sudden." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully, offering only mild encouragement, for she had learned that patience often revealed the truth more efficiently than direct questioning. As the day faded into evening, Miss Marple settled into her favourite chair by the fire, the warm glow illuminating her thoughtful face. She considered the subtle interactions of the day, the gestures, glances, and hesitation she had observed in St. Mary Mead. The ordinary often masked the extraordinary, and every detail mattered. Somewhere within the calm and the polite civility, the true story was hidden, and Miss Marple, with her quiet diligence, was prepared to uncover it, one careful observation at a time. The morning after Charlotte's collapse brought a soft drizzle over St. Mary Mead, lending a muted serenity to the village streets, yet the calm was deceptive. Though the rain softened the edges of the cobbled lanes, it did little to diminish the villagers' restless curiosity. Miss Marple, wrapped in her modest coat and carrying a small umbrella, walked deliberately toward Lavender Cottage, noting the cautious glances and lowered voices of those she passed. It was a day for observation, she decided, for the subtleties of human behaviour rarely revealed themselves amid bustling sunshine and distraction. Inside the cottage, Charlotte was more composed, though still pale. Mrs. Pettigrew fussed around her, ensuring comfort and warmth, while Edward Clark lingered nearby with a measured attentiveness that seemed almost rehearsed. Miss Marple greeted them with her usual calm, allowing the faint tension in the room to settle around her like a familiar cloak. "You're looking better this morning, Charlotte," she remarked, as much to set the scene as to encourage conversation. The young woman smiled weakly but did not protest the attention. As they spoke, Isabel Fenwick arrived once again, this time with a basket of flowers for Charlotte. She entered quietly, offering her greetings with a careful glance toward Edward Clark. Miss Marple noted Isabel's subtle anxiety, the way she hesitated near the doorway, the slight clench of her fingers, and the fleeting glance toward the now empty jam jar on the kitchen counter. Each detail reinforced the impression that someone's actions the previous day had left a ripple far beyond the immediate incident. Miss Marple, choosing her words carefully, engaged Edward Clark in a light conversation about trivial village matters, local fairs, the upcoming church bazaar and the weather's effects on the garden. All the while she observed him keenly. There was a rigidness to his posture, a measured pacing of speech, and an occasional flick of the eyes toward the kitchen, where the memory of the fallen jam jar seemed to linger. His movements were polite and controlled, yet the smallest gestures, the slight twitch of a finger, the tightness around his jaw spoke volumes to the experienced observer. Dr. Dobson arrived mid-morning, summoned by a call from Mrs. Pettigrew, who had grown concerned over Charlotte's lingering fatigue. The doctor performed his checks with professional detachment, though Miss Marple could detect a subtle curiosity in his expression when he glanced toward Edward Clark. No words were exchanged, but the shared understanding between the two adults was enough to note that suspicion, though unspoken, was quietly acknowledged. The afternoon was spent in a careful reconstruction of the previous day's events. Miss Marple, in casual conversation with Charlotte, Isabel, and even Mrs. Pettigrew, encouraged them to recount moments they had considered insignificant. "Sometimes," she said, "the smallest detail is the one that tells the whole story. A glance, a gesture, a movement unnoticed by most." Slowly, fragment by fragment, the narrative began to clarify. Isabel recalled seeing Edward Clark reach for the jam jar, and Charlotte mentioned a fleeting sensation of unease just before she touched it. Each account, minor though it seemed, fit neatly into a larger mosaic Miss Marple was forming in her mind. By late afternoon the rain had ceased, leaving the village bathed in the soft light of a clearing sky. Miss Marple walked to the garden, examining the fallen leaves and scattered petals from the party, noting the traces of human activity in the otherwise tidy grounds. She reflected on the behaviour of each person she had observed, the anxieties, hesitations, and inconsistencies that were easily overlooked by the casual eye. In St. Mary Mead, she knew, the truth often hid behind layers of politeness and assumed propriety, and patience was the key to revealing it. As the sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the veranda, Miss Marple returned inside and sat quietly, knitting untouched on her lap. The day's careful observations had reinforced a growing impression. The incident was no accident. Motive, opportunity, and subtle signs all pointed toward deliberate design. Somewhere amid the polite smiles and courteous gestures, a secret waited to emerge, and Miss Marple, patient as always, intended to uncover it in its own time. The next morning brought a pale, misty light over St. Mary Mead, and Miss Marple, with her ever-present basket in hand, made her way along the quiet streets, her mind fully engaged in the subtle calculations of human behaviour. The incident at Lavender Cottage had rippled through the village, leaving whispers and speculations in its wake. Each face she passed, shopkeepers arranging their displays, postmen delivering letters, neighbours exchanging brief nods, offered tiny clues, gestures, or expressions that Marple stored quietly in her ever-observant mind. By mid-morning she arrived at Lavender Cottage. Charlotte Clark, now seated comfortably in the sunlit veranda, was attended by Mrs. Pettigrew, who fussed over her tea and light refreshments. Edward Clark moved about the room with a controlled composure, checking on Charlotte while maintaining a polite distance. Isabel Fenwick arrived shortly thereafter, her expression a careful mixture of concern and vigilance. Miss Marple noted, with her customary attention to detail, the subtle interplay of glances among the three, Isabel's occasional furtive looks toward Edward, Edward's measured responses, and Charlotte's own cautious awareness. Each motion and glance seemed insignificant, yet in Miss Marple's experienced eyes, every movement carried meaning. As the group settled into a tentative routine, Miss Marple engaged Edward Clark in casual conversation, allowing him to speak while she carefully observed. He spoke politely about the village affairs, the ongoing church repairs, and the upcoming summer fair, but his voice occasionally faltered when the jam jar incident was mentioned, however indirectly. Miss Marple's gaze followed his hands as they rested lightly on the arm of a chair, noting the faint tremor in his fingers and the subtle rigidity in his posture. Human behaviour, she reminded herself, was far more revealing than the most practiced words. Later, Isabel and Miss Marple found a quiet moment in the garden. Isabel, tending to a small bed of pansies, spoke softly. "I cannot help but think there was more to yesterday than anyone suspects," she admitted. "Edward, he behaved oddly. It was not just concern for Charlotte, it was something else, though I cannot put my finger on it." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. "Often," she replied gently, "the truth lies not in what is obvious, but in the little things we overlook. A gesture, a glance, or a hesitation may speak louder than words." Isabel's eyes widened slightly, as though grasping the subtlety of Miss Marple's observation. The afternoon brought Dr. Dobson once more, summoned by Charlotte's slight lingering fatigue. He performed his routine checks, commenting only briefly on her condition, yet Miss Marple could detect the faint scrutiny in his gaze as it wandered to Edward Clark. No direct accusation was necessary. The tension in the room communicated itself without words. Meanwhile, Miss Marple's mind quietly traced the sequence of yesterday's events. The fall, the smudged jam jar, the behaviours of each participant. Each detail began to form a framework that, though incomplete, suggested a deliberate orchestration behind the seemingly accidental collapse. By early evening, a few villagers arrived at the cottage under the pretense of checking on Charlotte. Polite conversations masked the subtle probing of questions, each visitor testing the atmosphere, noting reactions and speculating quietly. Miss Marple observed all with calm detachment, cataloguing expressions, gestures and tones. Even the smallest inconsistencies, the way a guest's hand lingered on a teacup or the manner in which they avoided certain glances, added layers to her understanding. The village, seemingly ordinary and polite, revealed its undercurrents to the patient observer. As twilight approached, Miss Marple returned to her quiet contemplation by the fire. She sipped her tea, reflecting on the events of the past 2 days. The collapse at the garden party was no accident. There were motives, hesitations, and subtle behaviours that indicated intent. The village's calm exterior masked concealed anxieties and unspoken secrets. Somewhere amid the gestures, glances, and minor irregularities, the truth awaited discovery. Miss Marple, as always, was ready to follow each thread, patiently and quietly until the entire tapestry of human action revealed its hidden design. By the following morning, St. Mary Mead carried the faint chill of early summer, with dew still clinging to the hedgerows and the soft hum of village life gradually waking from its quiet slumber. Miss Marple, basket in hand, walked along the familiar lanes, noting the subdued conversations and careful glances exchanged between neighbours. The garden party incident remained the dominant topic of discussion, though it was veiled behind polite curiosity rather than outright fear. To Miss Marple, however, the subtle tensions in the air were far more revealing than any words spoken aloud. At Lavender Cottage, Charlotte was noticeably more composed. Mrs. Pettigrew fussed gently over her tea, while Edward Clark hovered at the edge of the veranda, a polite but rigid presence. Isabel Fenwick arrived soon after, bearing a small bouquet of fresh flowers, though her eyes constantly flicked toward Edward with an expression of quiet concern. Miss Marple, seated nearby, observed the interactions with patient attention. Every glance, hesitation or shift of posture offered insight into the unspoken dynamics of the household. The conversation began with light matters, the progress of the church repairs, local harvests, and the upcoming village fair. But under the surface, every remark carried weight. Miss Marple asked casual questions, allowing the participants to speak freely, while quietly noting subtle inconsistencies. Edward Clark, when prompted to describe the sequence of events at the garden party, hesitated slightly, then chose his words with careful precision. His eyes occasionally flicked toward the spot where the jam jar had been stored, betraying a minor tension in his otherwise controlled demeanour. Later in the morning, Dr. Dobson arrived to check on Charlotte's health. His professional attention was accompanied by faint curiosity as his gaze repeatedly swept over Edward Clark. Though he spoke no accusation, his manner suggested he too had noticed certain irregularities. Miss Marple, while politely engaging in conversation, paid close attention to the interplay of gestures, the timing of glances, and the subtle tightening of expressions. She reflected on how each individual's behaviour, however slight, could reveal motives or hidden anxieties that would remain invisible to the casual observer. During a brief lull in the afternoon, Miss Marple invited Isabel to the garden to examine the flower beds, under the pretence of enjoying the sunlight. Isabel's hands trembled slightly as she arranged the pansies, and she finally admitted, in a hushed tone, that Edward's behaviour the previous day had struck her as unusual, not merely worried for Charlotte, but tense in a way she could not explain. Miss Marple listened quietly, nodding thoughtfully, knowing that such small observations often held the key to understanding the intentions of others. The later part of the afternoon brought a small group of villagers ostensibly to check on Charlotte, though their real interest lay in the mysterious incident. Polite questions were asked, careful glances exchanged, and subtle reactions scrutinised. Miss Marple, as always, observed without intrusion. One visitor lingered too long on the discussion of the jam jar, while another avoided looking at Edward altogether. Each movement, each tiny reaction reinforced the emerging pattern of suspicion and concealment, giving Miss Marple a growing sense of how the threads of intention intertwined. As evening fell, painting the sky in soft shades of amber and rose, Miss Marple settled into her favourite chair by the fire. She reflected on the observations collected over the past few days, the gestures, hesitations, and unspoken tensions. The collapse at the garden party was no accident, she was certain. Motives were concealed beneath layers of politeness, and opportunities had been carefully orchestrated. Somewhere amid the ordinary routines and courteous behaviours of Saints, Mary Mead, the truth-awaited discovery, and Miss Marple, with patient diligence, intended to uncover it with the precision and subtlety that had become her hallmark. The next morning, St. Mary Mead awoke to a bright, crisp light that made the dew on the hedgerows glimmer like tiny jewels. Miss Marple, as was her custom, set out on her habitual walk, noting with keen interest the subtle undercurrents among the villagers. Shopkeepers greeted her politely, yet their eyes betrayed curiosity and, in some cases, unease. Conversations were cautious, carefully measured, as if the garden party incident had introduced a lingering tension that no one wished to acknowledge openly. By mid-morning, Miss Marple arrived at Lavender Cottage, where Charlotte Clark was now sitting upright in the sunlit veranda, looking more composed than she had in the past few days. Mrs. Pettigrew fussed gently over her tea and biscuits, her habitual chatter masking the underlying anxiety that had gripped the household since the collapse. Edward Clark stood nearby, polite and restrained, though the slight tension in his hands and the occasional flick of his eyes toward the now empty jam jar suggested unease. Isabel Fenwick arrived shortly thereafter, carrying a small basket of flowers, her demeanour cautious, her glances constantly shifting toward Edward, as if seeking reassurance or confirmation. Miss Marple engaged in quiet conversation with Edward, guiding the discussion with casual references to village affairs, the church repairs, the upcoming fair, and other mundane topics. Yet beneath this surface of civility, she observed him closely, the way he handled cups and saucers, the measured pacing of his words, the subtle flickers of hesitation in his eyes. Each minor detail added to the picture she was beginning to form, one that suggested the incident was no accident, but a carefully orchestrated event. Later, Isabel and Miss Marple found themselves alone in the garden. While arranging pansies, Isabel spoke in a hushed tone. "I still cannot make sense of it, Miss Marple," she confessed. Edward's behaviour before and after Charlotte fell was not what one would expect of a concerned uncle. There was tension, a watchfulness that made me uneasy. Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully, acknowledging the significance without revealing that she had long noticed the same subtleties. "Sometimes," she said gently, "the truth is hidden in the little things we overlook. The gestures, the hesitations, the glances that seem fleeting. They often tell us far more than words." As the afternoon wore on, Dobson arrived to check Charlotte's pulse and overall health, offering reassurances to Mrs. Pettigrew while maintaining a faint professional scrutiny of Edward Clark. Miss Marple observed the silent exchange, noting the doctor's subtle wariness, and filed it away for later reflection. Soon a few villagers called under the pretence of concern, but their inquiries carried undertones of curiosity and speculation. Polite remarks and casual questions masked probing glances and careful observation, all of which Miss Marple catalogued quietly, understanding that the smallest reactions could reveal the largest truths. By late afternoon the patterns became clearer. Edward Clark's meticulous composure, Isabel's anxious attentiveness, Charlotte's lingering unease, and the villagers' subtle reactions formed an intricate web of human behaviour. The jam jar, once a simple vessel of preserves, had become a symbol of hidden intention. Miss Marple, reflecting by the fire as the sun dipped low, contemplated the threads she had been following. Every gesture, hesitation and glance pointed toward deliberate action, carefully concealed by polite manners and ordinary routines. She knew the puzzle was close to resolution. The final pieces were within reach, and soon the careful study of human nature would reveal the truth behind the garden party incident. The morning air was crisp and fragrant with the scent of newly bloomed roses, yet the serenity of St. Mary Mead belied the tension that lingered in the village. Miss Marple, walking along the familiar lanes with her basket swinging at her side, noted how the slightest gestures and expressions of the villagers carried undercurrents of curiosity, caution, and speculation. Even the most mundane greetings seemed to conceal unspoken questions, and she stored each nuance carefully in her ever-attentive mind. At Lavender Cottage, Charlotte Clark had grown noticeably stronger. She sat in the veranda, a light shawl draped over her shoulders, and exchanged polite conversation with Mrs. Pettigrew, who fussed delicately over the arrangement of tea and biscuits. Edward Clark moved with careful composure nearby, though the subtle tension in his shoulders and the occasional flicker of his gaze toward the kitchen where the jam jar had been placed did not escape Miss Marple. Isabel Fenwick arrived mid-morning, carrying a small bouquet of daisies, her glances toward Edward almost instinctive, but betraying a lingering concern and unspoken awareness of yesterday's events. Miss Marple, seated comfortably in a low chair, initiated a casual conversation with Edward about the upcoming church bazaar and other village matters, all the while observing his behaviour with an unerring eye. He answered politely, his tone controlled, but there was a subtle rigidity in his posture, a slight hesitation in his words whenever the incident of the jam jar or Charlotte's collapse was mentioned indirectly. Miss Marple noted these small signs, recognising them as threads that might, if followed carefully, lead to the full picture of intent. Later, she invited Isabel to the garden under the pretence of inspecting the flower beds. While arranging the pansies, Isabel admitted softly, "I still find it difficult to understand Edward's behaviour yesterday. It was not merely concern for Charlotte, it was more deliberate, more calculated." Miss Marple, nodding thoughtfully, replied gently, "Sometimes it is the small, seemingly insignificant details, the brief glances, the hesitations, the gestures we barely notice that tell the truest story." Isabel's eyes widened as if she understood for the first time that such minor observations could carry immense significance. By the afternoon, Dr. Dobson returned for another check on Charlotte, offering reassurances about her recovery while casting discreet, observant glances at Edward Clark. Miss Marple noted the unspoken tension in the room, aware that even professional scrutiny could be swayed by subtle inconsistencies in behaviour. Soon after, a few villagers called, ostensibly to inquire about Charlotte's health. Their polite questions and measured expressions masked an undercurrent of speculation, and Miss Marple quietly catalogued each response, noting contradictions and hesitations that hinted at deeper truths. As the day waned and the sun dipped toward the horizon, Miss Marple sat quietly by the fire, her knitting untouched on her lap. Her mind pieced together the observations of the past days, Edward Clark's controlled tension, Isabel's apprehensive attentiveness, Charlotte's lingering unease, and the villagers' subtle reactions. The ordinary events of the garden party, combined with these minute behaviours, formed a pattern she recognised well. The incident was no accident, but a carefully orchestrated act concealed beneath layers of civility and polite gestures. Soon, she reflected, it would be necessary to test the intentions of the key participants, to watch for the reactions that would finally reveal the truth lying just beneath this surface of St. Mary Mead's serene exterior. Evening had settled over St. Mary Mead with a calm that seemed almost too perfect, as if the village itself were holding its breath. Miss Marple sat quietly in the sitting room of Lavender Cottage, the fire casting a warm glow over her serene, thoughtful face. Charlotte rested nearby, finally looking relieved, while Edward Clark and Isabel Fenwick moved about with polite civility, concealing the tension that had gripped them in recent days. Miss Marple had spent the afternoon arranging her observations, letting the threads of behaviour, gesture and subtle contradiction form a coherent pattern in her mind. She rose and addressed the room with a gentle authority, her voice soft but carrying an unmistakable clarity. "I believe the time has come for a small demonstration," she said, smiling faintly. Both Edward and Isabel looked toward her with polite curiosity, unaware of the trap Miss Marple had set so delicately. She continued, producing a fresh jar of strawberry jam from a sideboard, a simple object, yet one whose significance would soon become clear. "I noticed," emoji carded sevens, lifting the jar slightly, "that even ordinary items can reveal extraordinary truths. Observing the way people interact with them often uncovers intentions we might otherwise overlook." Her eyes met Edward Clark's, calm and unwavering. "Yesterday Charlotte's collapse was alarming and it appeared accidental. Yet I observed certain behaviours that suggested otherwise. Subtle hesitation, overly careful handling, and moments of tension that did not fit the scenario of concern alone." Edward shifted slightly, a faint tightening in his jaw betraying the careful control of his expression. Miss Marple, undisturbed, continued. "You see, Edward, a gesture is often more revealing than a word. The way you handled the jam jar before Charlotte touched it, the careful attention you paid to its placement, and the anxiety that flitted across your face when others noticed his goal, these were not signs of mere worry. They were signs of intent, poor but deliberate, and observable to a keen eye accustomed to reading human nature." A quiet tension filled the room. Edward's composure wavered just slightly, the faintest flicker of guilt passing across his features. Miss Marple's voice softened, her tone gentle but firm. "You were anxious, Edward, not for Charlotte's safety alone, but for yourself. You feared the consequences of a carefully planned action going unnoticed, and yet the smallest gestures gave you away. It was your own behaviour rather than any external proof that revealed the truth." Edward Clark's shoulders sagged, the polite facade slipping. He looked towards Charlotte, whose expression combined surprise and concern, and then to Miss Marple, whose quiet gaze seemed to pierce to the very heart of the matter. It was meant to be controlled," he confessed, voice low, eyes avoiding direct contact. "I only wanted to teach her a lesson, an accident, nothing more, but—" His words faltered, and the weight of his actions hung heavily in the air. Isabel Fenwick, still standing with her basket of flowers, exhaled sharply. "Edward! I had no idea," she said, her voice a mixture of shock and disbelief. Miss Marple inclined her head ever so slightly. "Intent, dear Isabel, can often masquerade as accident, but human behaviour rarely lies. The hesitation, the careful placement, and the tension all spoke plainly to the observant eye. There are no secrets that cannot be discerned when one watches closely and patiently." Charlotte, recovering from her initial shock, took a deep breath. "So it was not the jam itself, only the way it was handled?" she asked. Miss Marple nodded, her expression serene. "Exactly. No poison, no danger in the preserves themselves. What mattered were the actions surrounding the jar, and the small telling details that revealed the truth." By the time the villagers dispersed that evening scent, Mary Mead felt as though it had exhaled a long-held breath. Order and civility returned, though the memory of the incident lingered in polite conversations and thoughtful glances. Miss Marple, sitting quietly in her chair by the fire, reflected on the human nature she had observed, how fear, anxiety and intent often spoke louder than words, and how patience, subtlety, and careful observation could unravel even the most carefully concealed designs. The garden party had seemed a trivial event, yet it had exposed the hidden threads of human behaviour in the village. And as always, Miss Marple knew that, beneath the quiet exterior of St. Mary Mead, human nature, with all its complexities, would continue to provide both mischief and mystery, patiently waiting for the right observer to discern its truth.